Hi, welcome to session 3 of the fourth topic of the semester titled The Texas Revolution of 1836. Now, this is session 3, and we will proceed with finishing part 2. This is something we started in session 2 that looks at the origins and causes of the Texas Revolution itself. So, just to recapture what we covered in session 2 rather quickly, what we so far covered is a series of factors that led to the Texas Revolution, such as, for example, number one, it was really starting with Mexico's feudal institutions. Mexico still retains a lot of the Spanish feudal institutions that govern the colonies, of course, of Spain in the Americas, in this case, New Spain, centered, for example, on the institution of the Catholic Church that was dominant in New Spain, a great landowner, tax collector, in charge of education, for example. The other feudal institution, again, is the aristocracy or the large landowners centered around Mexico City that dominate pretty much the economy in Mexico and land, of course, and also the monarchical leadership. If you recall, we were talking about how Mexico, as it gains its independence from Spain, is going to create a very enlarged, if you will, presidency. You know, the president enjoyed a lot of privileges, if you will, executive power, wielded power just like a monarch, if you will. Okay, so again, this is something that is going to be problematic, at least for certain provinces of Mexico, like Texas. Because as Texas, as we'll see, began to change and modernize and transform their society and economy to become more liberal, if you will, is going to contrast rather sharply with the old feudal institutions of Mexico, headquartered in Mexico City. Another factor that we looked at in session 2 had to do with Texas' autonomous origins. That is to say that ever since Texas was settled and colonized by Spain, this province, which was really far removed from Mexico City, was pretty much isolated. The settlers of Texas were carrying out their activities in almost splendid isolation from the policies of both Spain and also the policies enacted in Mexico City. So again, this geographical isolation was a great advantage for the creation of autonomous towns that were self-regulated, self-ruled, self-governed by their own city councils. The members of the locality were really in control, if you will, of those towns, creating policies that the towns required without necessarily following the dictates of Mexico City or Spain. That is to say, so this was a great advantage. And so that's the second reason. We also looked at the third reason having to do with the rise of capitalism itself in Texas. Texas will be one of the forerunners, if you will, one of the states or provinces in Mexico that pioneered capitalism, if you will, in Mexico. And this had to do with, for example, cattle ranching. We talked about how in the late 1700s we're going to see the emergence of very large cattle ranches owned by very wealthy families, of course, that built their fortunes from cattle exports. They began to export cattle, first by driving cattle south into deep in Mexico, like in Nuevo León or Tamaulipas, in those cattle markets, but also exporting cattle into French Louisiana in New Orleans as well. And that's how, again, we're going to see the creation of great enterprises, cattle ranches, again, that were considered private property by those families. Again, this is what capitalism is, the idea of private property. Later on, as the colony of New Spain becomes independent by 1821, what we discussed is that liberals in Mexico, this group of intellectuals and politicians that are going to exert significant influence in Mexico City, wanted to modernize Mexico. And they preferred really to do it by inviting Americans, if you will, to invest in Mexico, even to settle and colonize parts of Mexico like Texas. So they will bring their ideas, their capital, their technologies, the enterprises, if you will, so Mexico could become very much like the United States. The liberals really want to imitate the United States economically and politically. So they created this open door policy to allow Americans to colonize Texas, for example. And of course, there was liberals in Texas. There were liberal politicians like the Navarro family, for example, we talked about, that also promoted and fostered American colonization. And we see starting around 1825, again, the very first policies to invite Americans on a large scale to settle in Texas, the colonization law of 1825. And again, that was done through the so-called empresario contracts. If you recall, the empresario contracts were actually contracts awarded to or given to colonization agents, American for the most part, to bring American settlers into Texas to colonize it, and they were given land, in other words, as a reward. So again, we see the development of different colonies in Texas, led by different individuals, or empresarios as they were called. And those empresarios, of course, used the land they received from Mexico to initiate other kinds of enterprises, such as real estate. We talked about that. We see the formation of real estate companies also. In Texas, they were pretty much dividing the land and selling plots of land to investors or cotton plantations from the United States, or merchants or farmers, and they were speculating with the land. That is to say, they were really putting tax, different prices on different sectors of the land, and really making money from selling land or land development. We also see, of course, cotton plantations. This is another enterprise that is going to flourish in Texas. The arrival of American Southern planters in pursuit of land to grow cotton. Again, this is going to also lead to this cotton economy in Texas, this enterprise as well. Texas is beginning to export cotton to the United States and to England as well. So as we see, again, the formation of different kinds of enterprises in which people are now seeing in Texas that they're owning property, whether it's land or it's farmland or cattle ranches or cotton plantations or land development enterprises, real estate, and so on. And again, this is capitalism itself. So when those interests are going to be threatened, as we'll see, this is going to set off, of course, the independence movement. One of the last reasons we covered, the fourth reason, had to do with the Mexico's anti-slavery laws, because Mexico is very much aware that there's an increasing presence now of African slaves brought by the southern planters from the United States, something that is outlawed in Mexico, and this is going to lead to an attempt to ban the slave trade and the practice of slavery in Texas. In 1830, there will be an anti-slavery law prohibiting the import of African slaves into Texas. And of course, this is going to set off, of course, conflict in Texas, because, plantation owners are worried that, it's just a matter of time when Mexico was going to outlaw slavery altogether and, of course, seize their properties, perhaps not only just the slaves, but also their lands. They're worried about also, again, Mexico pretty much backtracking, if you will, all of the deals and the contracts that they signed, and pretty much abolishing all of those colonies. This is what American settlers are worried about. Now, let's turn now our attention to our outline here. It appears now. All right. And we're moving forward now. Now that I have provided this summary of session two, now let's proceed to understand the fifth cause that led to the Texas Revolution. And that has to do with the change of government in Mexico. Okay, Mexico is going to transition from one form of government into another that will diminish to a very large degree the autonomy of Texas. It's not just Texas, but really of all of the states of Mexico. And we are going to see the emergence of a new Mexican republic. It's not going to be a liberal republic with a federal system of government that divided powers between the local, state, and federal levels, but rather a system of government that centralized all the authority in Mexico City, reducing the power of the states and the towns to a very large degree. So the towns and the states are going to be now totally at the mercy of Mexico City, with very little power for them to craft policy. This is what was known as the centralized republic, centralized authority in Mexico City. This is a process, of course, that took years to form. It did not really suddenly emerge in 1835 when the process was finally completed. This is something that got started as early as 1830, because in that year we're going to see the faction that opposed the liberals in Mexico gaining more and more power. The liberals in Mexico that want Mexico to become like the United States faced opposition from this other faction known as the centralists, or the conservatives for that matter. The conservatives and the centralists are the same. And the reason is that the conservatives in Mexico, or the centralists, see that Mexico is going way too liberal, that is to say, and that the old feudal institutions of Mexico were being threatened, and they considered those institutions as vital for the health, for the security, and the integrity of Mexico. For example, they saw that the liberals were threatening the Catholic Church, the domination, the dominance of the Catholic Church. Liberals wanted to seize the land holdings of the church. They wanted to prevent the church from collecting taxes. They wanted to prevent the church from being in charge of education, for example. And this is something that conservatives do not agree with at all. They deem the church extremely essential for Mexican society to create stability, that is to say, and order. Stability and order, that is to say. The centralists or conservatives also believe that the liberals are threatening another institution that they consider to be extremely essential and vital for Mexico, and that is the Mexican army. Liberals really are against the privileges of the Mexican army. The Mexican army enjoyed significant entitlements and privileges, such as, for example, the most important one is that the Mexican army was not liable to civil law. So whenever a member of the Mexican army committed a crime, they could not be tried or judged by a civil court. That is to say, they had to be tried and judged by their own courts inside of the Mexican army. And of course, what liberals claimed is that this opened the door for a lot of abuses by the Mexican army, that they could just abuse the population and they were not liable to any lawsuits or civil persecution or punishment. So they want the Mexican army to be more responsible and more liable, again, to the citizenry of Mexico. Conservatives don't agree with that. They really believe that Mexico requires a strong army with all the privileges and entitlements that it enjoys. Because this is a newborn nation, they said, and you cannot have a reduced or weakened military. You need to have a very strong military. So again, they also consider the military as essential for the security of Mexico. The centralists or conservatives also believe that the federal system of government of Mexico is weak. That when you divide power between the local, state, and federal levels, what you do is that the nation gets too fragmented. In other words, that there's no unity. There's no national unity in Mexico, because when you give power to the towns and give power to the states to craft their own policies and laws, well, it's almost like you're granting independence to every province, to every state and town. They don't feel that they're part of a larger nation. They're simply going about their business, crafting their own policies, and all they care is about their locality. They don't really care about the nation, and this creates the opportunity for those states and localities to break up. So in order to create national unity and to bring the country together, to strengthen the country politically, they favor instead a strong centralized state. Very strong centralized state. Power to be concentrated in Mexico City, and all policies are directed and even dictated by Mexico City to all the states. This is how you bring those states together. This is how you forge unity. The centralists just think that federalism, this distribution of power, will eventually disintegrate the country. Inevitably, they will say. This is a newborn country. We're learning how to be a country, they said. We're barely learning what a nation is. So granting too much independence to all the states is not the way to create a country. So that's why they favor centralization. That's why they want to create a centralized state, of course. And this is something, of course, that they're thinking about Texas as well. That Texas is just too far away from Mexico, and that this province, they say, is just too loose. It's too free, if you will. That it's just a matter of time, they said, that this province is going to break away from Mexico. Indeed, the centralists are beginning to worry in 1830 about the presence of Americans in Texas, because what they say is that, the demographics of Texas is changing, and how do we guarantee that the newcomers, the new settlers of Texas, are going to be loyal to Mexico? Okay, so the centralists, as a matter of fact, starting in 1830, will oppose American colonization. Not the liberals. The liberals very much welcome it. They were the ones that actually crafted those policies to invite Americans into Texas, but the conservatives or centralists, by 1830, they're opposing further American colonization by this time. They fear that this is going to lead to Texas secession, or Texas independence, if you will. So the conservatives introduced a law in 1830 called the Law of April 6 of 1830, in which what they stated in this law is that from this point onwards, Mexico will not allow any further American immigration. So it's both American immigration, but also the import of African slaves in Texas. So consider this an anti-immigration law, but also an anti-slavery law. It's both. Okay. Um, and if you look at Mexican public opinion during this time, almost all over the country, with of course some exceptions, this law was not necessarily unpopular across Mexico. Some states, there's a large segment of the population of Mexico that kind of agreed with this, just because they also feared that Texas was changing too much demographically. Of course, not the population makeup. In other words, is just overwhelmingly made up of immigrants, for example, and that it will be just a matter of time when this province in the northern frontier of Mexico was going to break apart. So if you read the newspapers, really from 1830 to 1835, all over Mexico, there were articles written, of course, by intellectuals and journalists who were actually talking about Texas in this fashion, and they were not necessarily conservative. So the conservatives were not really necessarily alone in this kind of mentality, in this kind of thinking, if you will, about Texas. There were people who were not necessarily conservative nor liberal, but they kind of agreed again that that Texas was on the verge, if you will, of secession. Okay, that it will just break away from the country and so on and so forth. Again, you can see very clearly in all the newspapers of Mexico those kinds of news, if you will. Okay. The conservatives or centralists also pushed for anti-slavery legislation, and they, of course, as I mentioned in session 2, feared that the slave owners of Texas were gaining too much power because of the kind of economy that were involved in, the cotton economy. Cotton was very, very expensive in the world market. There were great fortunes being made by the cotton growers in the U.S. South and now in Texas. And of course, this is really leading to an unprecedented power, if you will, in Mexico, and that is slave power. People that own slaves are growing and exporting cotton, amassing great fortunes, and of course that economic power could be used for political gain, of course. So in order to start really limiting the growth of this power of the slaveholding community, if you will, in Texas, the centralists or conservatives pushed for a law to abolish the inheritance of slaves. That people who own slaves could not pass on their slaves to their descendants, but also that the offspring of the slaves will be free. In other words, if a slave, there's a couple, of course, in a plantation, they have offspring, that the offspring will not inherit the status of slaves. They will be born free, that is to say. Okay, so this also again threatened the power of the slave owners, in Texas as well. Another policy crafted by the centralists that went against the interest of this province, Texas, was that because this province was growing in population, it was already, by the 1830s, reaching over 30,000, and it will be by 1835 over 40,000. By the way, it was growing exponentially, really. Because the population was growing, well, it demanded, of course, a lot of products that in many cases the province did not produce. So it was importing a lot of products, particularly a lot of products from the United States. But they were not paying any taxes, okay, on those imports. So, well, instead of this province actually importing the products from Mexico City, from the major producers in the Central Valley of Mexico, and so on and so forth, this province was trading freely with the United States. And Mexico City wanted to change that, of course, the centralists. So they began to pretty much impose tariffs or taxes on imports. Okay, so for any product imported into Texas from the United States or any other country, the residents of Texas will now have to pay a tax on that, of course. Again, so this really created a lot of resentment among the settlers of Texas, and know that they have to now pay taxes or duties on imports. That is to say, another policy crafted by the centralists regarding Texas is that in order to deter further immigration from the United States, the centralists began to build a series of forts in the northern eastern section of Texas, from where Americans were coming from, of course, and sending troops there in order to deter American colonization, okay, to enforce the law of 1830 that they just passed. Okay, so there's now an increasing presence of Mexican troops, okay, in Texas. Again, once again, to kind of halt American immigration, if you will. Okay, this is also going to create a lot of worries, a lot of concerns among the residents of Texas that, well, maybe we're really looking at a change of affairs here. Mexico City is tightening control in the country, is creating more and more military control of Texas and other provinces again. So, this freedom, if you will, that the settlers enjoyed in the past was slowly but surely coming to an end. Last but not least, the centralists also denied a petition by the residents of Texas to become a single state, because during this time, Texas was not necessarily a totally separate state from all the other states of Mexico. It was conjoined with another province called Coahuila. It was called Coahuila and Tejas, or Coahuila and Texas, that is to say. So it was a single state. They kind of joined two states into one. Texas and Coahuila were one, even though back in the colonial period, those were totally two separate states. And the capital of Coahuila and Tejas was headquartered in Saltillo, Coahuila. So that means that the seat of power, all the decisions were made, was in Coahuila, not in Tejas or Texas, that is to say. So the residents of Texas felt that they were over or underrepresented. They were overpowered by the state of Coahuila, because the state of Coahuila had more residents, and so they didn't have really a say in the politics of the state, because this other state called Coahuila pretty much had the seat of government, and they control pretty much the state politics, that is to say. So they wanted to create their own separate entity, their own separate state, with their own capital, perhaps in San Antonio, for example. The Centralists denied that petition. They denied Texas independence from Coahuila. They will say, no, you will remain part of Coahuila. So this is also going to create a lot of resentment again among the residents of Texas that, remember political representation. This is the kind of culture that Americans brought into Texas. that the ideal form of government is a government that actually represents the interests, the opinions of the population. And they don't feel very represented, again, in this kind of arrangement. So you can see how those issues are going to be uh, presented again in the discussions among the Texas residents that, well, we are really not properly represented in the state of Mexico. All right, so now, besides all of those policies that the centralists were passing that affected Texas directly, the other issue with the centralists is that by 1835, we're going to see the centralists now taking charge of the country. They're going to displace the liberals, drive them out of power by force, and installed a new republic. They're going to dissolve the federalist system and instead create a new system of government that is going to centralize all authority in Mexico City. This process occurred between 1835 and 1836, the rise of this centralized republic. Finally, again, the centralists believed that the time had come for this change to take place. Now, how this happened? Well, there was, of course, a general, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. We have talked about Santa Anna in the past, who really had become like the strong man in Mexican politics. He was the commander of the Mexican armed forces. So because he commanded the army, he pretty much dominated the country, politically, that is to say. So whenever there was a problem in the country, Santa Anna will come into Mexico City, take charge, and kind of create a sense of stability in Mexico City, even though it was very short-lived, by the way, because there's a lot of fighting in Mexico between the liberals and the conservatives, back and forth, back and forth. So he was the kind of referee or the person that would just come in and kind of take charge and calm the waters for a little bit again. So in 1833, he decides to take charge of the country, and he became president of Mexico in 1833 because there was, again, a series of upheavals in Mexico City. The conservatives and liberals were actually fighting. There was one president being assassinated, as a matter of fact, during those upheavals and so on. So it's a lot of instability. So in 1833, Santa Anna decides to become president himself. So he's the commander of the Mexican armed forces, but he decides to take charge. Now, he's not really a politician. He's going to be there for a while until the country kind of calmed down for a while. And he's going to go back to his ranch in Veracruz, of course, and kind of direct the government from his private ranch. He doesn't want to be in Mexico City. He's not really a politician, okay? So he left his own vice president in charge. He said, well, I'm going to leave you in charge. You're going to govern the country on my behalf, of course. Now, the vice president, Valentin Gomez Farias was his name, was a liberal, okay? And, well, now that he is actually the president, well, Santa Anna is really the president, but now he's in charge of the country. He's in Mexico City. He is now the president, if you will. He decides to take this opportunity. He said, well, I have Santa Anna's blessing. I'm a liberal. I have his backing. So I'm going to start now really pushing for a lot of change and a lot of reforms. I want to transform Mexico and make Mexico a liberal country, all at once, very rapidly. Push for all the changes that he needs to dissolve and dismantle the old colonial institutions of Spanish Mexico. Again, he's not going to consult Santa Anna. He's just doing it. He thinks he has Santa Anna's backing, of course. So, number one, he abolished the church and army privileges, the immunities. They're called fueros, the immunities. The church was immune, just like the army was immune to civil law. The church was also immune. It's called fueros, immunity. They had total immunity whenever they committed felonies or crimes. They were not liable to civil law. Well, Valentin Gomez Faria says, well, you're no longer protected. You're no longer immune. Again, you will be persecuted if you violate the law, okay, by the state. So he's threatening the power of the church and the army right there. Number two, he prohibited the clergy, the priest, to preach during Mass, to intervene in politics, because this was very common. The priests, besides providing Mass in Mexico, they use also their time to talk about politics. And of course, they favor the conservatives. They will denigrate the liberals and the liberal policies, and they molded public opinion. They really convinced the population that the liberals, again, were against the nation and so on and so forth, against society and against God. Now, they were atheists and all of that, again. So, Valentin Gomez Faria says, we hereby proclaim that the clergy cannot intervene in politics anymore. Number three, Valentin Gomez Farias also took away the power of education away from the church. He says, no, education should be secular. What is secular education? Secular education is when you have a system of education that leaves religion out of the teaching. You instead teach children about science, physics, chemistry, mathematics, law, etc., but without religious elements, without religious teachings. Okay? Very worldly, very materialistic, if you will, kind of education. That's secular education. He wanted to create a public education system in which the state will be teaching children all the essentials without religion, in other words. Number four, he abolished the mandatory tithes. It was mandatory for people to tithe, to pretty much, pay monies to the church. And so it was a form of tax. Well, he eliminated that. And number five, Valentin Gomez Farias also wanted to privatize some of the church land holdings as well. The largest tracts of land owned by the church were in the hands of the missions. There were hundreds of missions scattered across Mexico, some of which were also in Texas, by the way. A mission was not just the building in which the missionaries were bringing the Native American population to teach them about Christianity. It also encompassed a large tract of land all around it. Okay, for farming, for cattle ranching, for hunting, you name it. It was a huge estate, if you will. What the liberals want is privatize those lands. In other words, they want to seize those land holdings from the missions so they could actually sell it to private investors. They really want to create private property in Mexico, and they said, well, in order to create private property in Mexico, we need to seize those lands from the church and put it on the market for people to buy for all kinds of projects. For agriculture, for cattle ranching, for mining, for for land development, for housing, doesn't matter. Okay, for people to own land. And so he pretty much went against the power of the church with those policies, but he's also going against the power of the army, by the way. It's not just the church. So, of course, there's going to be a reaction, a backlash among the conservatives or the centralists that this was totally unacceptable. So the church and the army appealed to Santa Anna. They went to his ranch, in other words, in Veracruz, to intervene in this. This was just outrageous, unacceptable. How is it that we're going to diminish the power of the church in this fashion? Okay, education is now going to be in the hands of the state, not the church anymore. The church cannot collect taxes. The lands of the church will be seized, and so on. Priests cannot preach during mass. Removing the immunities of the church and the army. So they appealed to Santa Anna, and they kind of presented a deal to him. And the deal is, look, we want you to intervene, but in a more decisive way. We're willing to support the creation of a new republic. We want you to be the king or monarch, leader, dictator, whatever name you want, but we want you to be the person in charge of Mexico. Only if you protect the church, the army, and of course the large landowners, if you protect those institutions, you have our backing. So of course he couldn't resist the temptation that he had the support of perhaps the most powerful institutions of Mexico, the very conservative, old, feudal institutions that were threatened by those new reforms, the new liberal reforms. And of course, he succumbed, if you will, to those temptations and decides to overthrow the Mexican Republic. The Mexican Federal Republic was overthrown by Santa Anna. Santa Anna takes the army into Mexico City. He overthrows Valentin Gomez Farias, who was the vice president in charge of the country, by the way. And after doing that, he abolished the Constitution of 1824. That was the functioning Constitution of Mexico. It was a federal constitution, very similar to the U.S. Constitution, again, that I explained earlier. He dissolves that altogether, Santa Anna. He pretty much overthrows, in other words, not only the president, but dissolves the government altogether, because he's about to create a new form of government, a centralized republic. Okay, a centralized republic. Here's again Santa Anna. And he introduced a new constitution in 1835, a centralist constitution, a centralized state. Remember, this is centralizing all authority in Mexico City. Mexico City will be the supreme authority of Mexico. It's not going to share any power anymore with any of the states or any of the localities, towns, so on, of Mexico. And power will be totally centralized in the figure of the president. Him, that is to say. The president will become the supreme authority of Mexico. You want to call this a dictatorship? Fine. It's maybe a new form of monarchy. Okay? This is something that, people were in Mexico, the centralists, the conservatives, were very fond of. They really admired the monarchical systems of government, monarchies. They believe that this is a very strong system of government that works, that creates order and unity and so on. So again, the centralists and the conservatives were jubilant that this change is taking place. Of course, they haven't, like a new king, if you will. He's not really called a king, but he's the supreme ruler. The term of president under this new constitution will be 8 years, with the possibility of endless, re-election, of course. So this is pretty much like a lifetime, if you will, appointment. Um, the states are dissolved in Mexico, and they're reduced to what is called military districts. So this happened to Texas. Texas is no longer a state or a province. You're from now on considered just a military district, okay? With no power whatsoever, because all of the political administrators of those military districts will be appointed by Santa Anna himself. The members of the city councils of each town, for example, the governors of every military district will be appointed by Santa Anna. The president appoints all the political bosses personally because they're loyal to Santa Anna, they obey Santa Anna directly. So, again, this is no longer a system of political representation anymore. Okay? Something that we saw, of course, in the first session with King Charles I in the English Civil War. He believed in the divine rights of kings, denying, any rights to the merchants, denying their rights to property, or denying even a vote or voicing an opinion about what laws needed to be passed by him. It's quite similar. Not identical, but similar. But was more, perhaps, alarming was that in order to hold office, besides being in very good terms with Santa Anna, you needed to be part of the Mexican elite. Okay? You needed to be extremely wealthy in order to be even considered for any of the appointments by Santa Anna. So he's just appointing people with high annual income, that is to say, the richest people of Mexico, are the ones that are getting the spoils, in other words. If you want the governorship, for example, of Texas, well, besides being a favorite of Santa Anna, you need to be very wealthy as well, okay, in order to hold office. So that's another thing, that this is an aristocracy. This is a group of very wealthy landowners that are now taking charge of the entire country, if you will. Okay? Totally unacceptable by the political culture of Texas, which is very liberal, by the way. With the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment, for example. The consent of the governed. What happened to the consent of the governed? The ideal form of government is one in which people are represented in the state, but also that the population chooses their own leaders or rulers. Remember, the consent of the government, of the governed. What happened to that? So there's no social contract. This is what the residents of Texas are saying, is that the social contract between the government and the government has been broken. In other words, that covenant, that agreement, in which the people chooses their own leaders, again, has been abolished. Now, as this constitution took effect, this new centralized republic, there will be uprisings across Mexico. There will be several states that rose up against Santa Anna and declare themselves in open rebellion. So this is not just Texas. This is very important for you to understand that the Texas Revolution was just one of the many of the revolutions that erupted in Mexico after he seized power in 1835. For example, Yucatan, this is the southeast part of Mexico, they even declared independence themselves. In fact, they became a republic, the Republic of Yucatan, as a matter of fact. They resisted, revolted against Santa Anna, and declared independence from Mexico. We see also insurgencies in San Luis Potosí, Durango, Tamaulipas, Querétaro, Nuevo León. Those were very liberal, by the way, very liberal states, including Texas, of course. And of course, this lecture concerns Texas, so we're going to have to pay, of course, very close attention to Texas itself, of course. And this is what we're going to be doing now in part 3. Part 3 of this topic will look at the Texas War for Independence. Okay? And now that we understand really the background and the causes for the Texas Revolution, now let's look at the Texas War for Independence. Texas, of course, will be one of the many Mexican states that will declare also independence from Mexico. They resisted Santana's rule. They wanted the restoration, of course, of the Mexican Constitution of 1824. But because this was not possible, or Santana was not willing to do that, of course, they declared independence, of course. Now, what we need to understand here is that Texas revolutionary movement that erupted in 1836 after Santana seized power was not really the very first time that the residents of Texas were actually thinking of independence. There were early signs of Texas independence, as a matter of fact, that go back to the 1820s. Okay, so this is very important. The idea of independence was brewing. It was already present in certain communities, in certain regions of Texas, that is to say. For example, in 1826, we see an American, one of the American settlers of Texas. His name was Hayden Edwards. He lived in the town of Nacogdoches. In 1826, he armed a rebellion. He, along a group of armed men, actually rose up in the town, seized the town, and declared independence. Okay? They proclaimed that they were no longer part of Mexico and that they were forming a new republic. Now, granted, this is really an isolated event. This is not going to create a mass following. This is not really a massive movement across Texas. This is just in one town called Nacogdoches, of course. He proclaims the formation of a republic. He called it the Fredonian Republic, in 1826. It was an insurrection. It was an open rebellion, of course. Now, during this time, still, the American colonization was barely getting started. Again, 1826 is not really the time when we see a large presence of Americans, not yet. But even the Americans that were here were not really that interested in following, if you will, this motion. In fact, Stephen F. Austin will intervene in this rebellion and pretty much convince Hayden Edwards to leave this insurrection, to put it at rest, and instead go back to peace. So he had to mediate, if you will, because he was really, in very good terms with Mexico City. 1826 still, the liberals are in charge, and they're working with the liberals in Texas, or the Tejanos, or the Anglo-Americans. There was good relationships, by the way. So it did not really move any further. But this is an early sign that some of the residents of Texas were already thinking about independence. In 1832, however, things are changing now. And things are changing because clearly, for reasons that I just explained, starting in 1830, the conservatives or the centralists were pushing for a lot of legislation and laws that were affecting the interests of Texas. If you recall that, taxing Texas on imports, for example, the anti-slavery laws, the anti-colonization laws, for example, sending uh, troops into Texas to halt American immigration and the like. So clearly, there are signs all over the wall, so to speak, that the policies of Mexico City were changing, that there's a growing faction in Mexico City of politicians that were not really welcoming uh, the American presence in Texas, in other words. Okay? So by 1832, clearly, the Anglo-American settlers are going to hold meetings, and one of the meetings was called the Consultation of 1832. They're discussing now what should we do, because we got the law of 1830, the removal again of the law of 1830 is being discussed. How do we free ourselves from this law that limits the import of African slaves and that is trying to also halt American immigration of Texas? They're consulting, they're holding an assembly in San Felipe, Austin. They're meeting there, and this is another sign that they're contemplating independence. Even though they're not declaring independence, there's already a motion there that, we're going to have to do something, in other words. And of course, they're meeting there to discuss the separation of Coahuila and Texas, something we already discussed, a motion that was denied anyways. Okay? So they want to free themselves from Coahuila, and they want to remove the law of 1830, and they're now holding this meeting in San Felipe, Austin. That's another, again, early sign that the settlers of Texas are contemplating, again, the idea of independence. This is going to materialize, of course, with Santa Anna's takeover of Mexico. When Santa Anna takes over Mexico in 1835, introducing this new constitution, the centralized state, the Tejanos, which is again the Mexican residents of Texas, along with the Anglo-Americans, both together revolt against the centralized state. Okay? There's going to be an alliance, in other words, between the Tejanos and the Americans to resist Santa Anna. They want autonomy for Texas. In other words, they want Texas to be self-regulated, self-governed, the way it was in the past under the Constitution of 1824. They fear that their property rights are at stake, because, this Constitution is just empowering Santa Anna to be the supreme authority of Mexico. So what that means is if you're not really obeying his will, if you're resisting or you're not really content or happy with the situation, he can just seize your property. He can pretty much abolish all the contracts. Remember, this is a culture of contracts. It's called capitalism. It's a contractual system. We have, in which contracts should be honored and fulfilled. And again, this has been threatened as well. Okay, it's a lot of land, that both Tejanos and Anglos, of course, own in Texas, and they feel all of this is at stake, of course, and because they're liberals, they feel that they're going to be targeted by the centralists or the conservatives. Of course, they're going to go against them. And they also fear that because this new centralized state is protecting and empowering the Catholic Church, that the Catholic Church will just demand the Protestant communities in Texas, the Anglo-American communities are Protestant, by the way, that their religious freedom is at stake as well. Like, look, this is just a matter of time when religious freedom will come to an end. Okay, so they're very, very afraid that this new state is going to reduce Texas to a department or a district in which Santa Anna is going to replace, if you will, all the landowners. The major political bosses will be appointed by him, and the centralists or the conservatives will seize the state of Texas, in other words. So there will be a series of revolts. Now, this was not all organized and centralized in Texas. It's not going to be just one massive centralized movement and army in which everybody's participating. There's going to be the formation of different factions, if you will, different leaders that have their own followers, and they're going to form a small military force, and they're going to be taking certain towns of Texas. For example, William Travis takes the town of Anahuac. He has his private force, and they take the town of Anahuac in 1835. It's a sign of resistance and rebellion against Santa Anna. Okay, there's a proclamation of rebellion, of course. There are other insurgents. In other words, they're all operating on their own. Other insurgents take the presidio or the military fort at Goliad. Okay, those are individual happenings, if you will, events at Goliad. Other insurgents as well capture San Antonio de Bejar, the town of San Antonio, that is to say, and they headquarter themselves in a mission called El Alamo. Again, this is an old Spanish mission that was used to Christianize the natives from the region. And they seize El Alamo, and of course, and they headquarter themselves there, and they proclaim, of course, also a posture of rebellion and resistance against Santa Anna as well. So there are several places that are being captured: Anahuac, Goliad, San Antonio, by different insurgent groups, if you will. Again, there are a lot of hotspots, if you will, all over Mexico, by the way. Okay, so this is not just, in Texas, it's all over Mexico. So in 1935, we're going to see another consultation, another assembly in 1935. The Texas residents meet once again in San Felipe de Austin in order to now form, if you will, a general council. They're trying to form their own government, in other words, in Texas, a parliament, for example. You want to call it an assembly, a parliament, a little congress, if you will, that are made up of representatives from different localities. They're going to actually form it there. And we're going to see also the formation of a revolutionary army as well. Okay, so this is the very first time that we're going to see something emerging that will be called the Revolutionary Army, again, led by Sam Houston. So Sam Houston was the army commander of this new force, and he will try to recruit, of course, the different insurgent groups into this large force, but this will be perhaps the largest force in operation during the Texas Revolution, of course. They write a Declaration of Independence. This is a document that was crafted on a region, a community known as Washington on the Brazos on March the 2nd, in which it really draws on the ideas of the American independence document, the Declaration of Independence, okay, the United States, drafted in 1776. The same principles are present here. That's why we discussed the American Revolution just briefly in session 1, because there are strong parallels between the American Revolution and the Texas Revolution. We see also a Texas Declaration of Independence that uses the same principles, if you will, the same liberal principles, that is to say. What the Declaration of Independence, written here on March the 2nd in Texas, is saying is that the new government of Mexico, led by Santa Anna, has, of course, violated the rights of citizens, okay, the natural rights of life, liberty, and property that humans are born with. Okay, life, liberty, and property. It's a justification for revolution. This document is really saying, we have a just cause to revolt because this is an illegitimate form of government that goes against the natural rights of citizens. That is to say, Santana has overthrown the Constitution of 1824 that respected those rights, that granted independence to the localities, to the states. He himself has become a tyrant. Okay? This is a very similar language used in the English Civil War against King Charles I and the American Revolution against King George III of Great Britain. Divine rights of kings, for example, absolutism, an absolute ruler, for example. Okay? It's against the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment. He has denied religious freedom, this new government, if you will, and of course military repression that the army has been sent into Texas to repress the peoples of Texas, take away their rights and liberties and the like. Again, when the army was building garrisons to prevent American colonization. So it's a justification for revolution. Now, of course, Santana, being a general, decides to leave the presidential office in Mexico City and put down the rebellions. So he's going to create an army, and of course, creating an army in Mexico was increasingly difficult. The dilemma of the Mexican army is that it was in no position to be putting down rebellions because there were massive desertions, by the way, in the Mexican army. It was a common problem. One of the dilemmas of the Mexican army is that it constantly faced desertions. In other words, this is not an army made of professionals, that this is a standing army that recruits people that are trained year by year and is very well prepared. It has resources, it has modern technologies and the like. It's very ill equipped. And very often, people have to be recruited by force, from the countryside, sometimes peasants who have no prior experience in military combat whatsoever. So those are actually just newcomers, if you will, in many cases, that are put, in a uniform. They're being given a rifle and okay, let's go and fight and march. And in many cases, they just don't feel connected to that institution or don't even understand what they're doing. Okay, we're going to be marching and pretty much putting down rebellions. Well, as those soldiers arrive to a place, they see that the people that are fighting are just like them. They're peasants or farmers or etc. People from the general population. So it's very problematic. Okay, so Santana hardly raises an army. It takes a lot of time for him to actually raise a large force under those circumstances. But he actually decides to actually just take charge, nonetheless assemble this force of 6,000 troops and lead the troops up north. And of course, he's really thinking about Texas, but on the way to Texas, he's going to be putting down a lot of rebellions as he's moving up north, of course. The ordeals of the Mexican army, again, is that they were running out of food constantly. They were traveling in, areas that were very muddy. There were muddy roads in many cases. They got stuck constantly, and it was very difficult to be advancing, fast from place to place. They had to be scrambling for food or demanding, food from the local population as they traveled. It was increasingly difficult, of course, let alone, of course, disease. In many cases, there were outbreaks of disease. So again, this is not a very well prepared force that is totally equipped to deal with a war of independence, led by thousands, of course, of people, in the northern provinces. Okay, it's very problematic. Nonetheless, as Santana is moving from region to region of Mexico, putting down rebellion and forcing people to join the army. It's a forced conscription, it's called, recruiting people by force. He finally arrives into Texas. He marches into this town that he is very well aware that has been taken. One of the largest towns was San Antonio de Bejar. And he arrives there in 1836, surrounds the town, and he surrounds, of course, the mission, El Alamo, and demands, of course, the insurgents or the rebels to surrender. He cut out all supplies, all lines of supplies, whether it's food or water, to the rebels stationed at El Alamo, of course. And after a series, of course, of attempts to force them to capitulate, to surrender, he finally decides to storm the Alamo, and of course, everybody inside will be killed. Of course, over 400, of course, people that were in there, and they were all perished, by the way. Some of them were actually captured. They tried to run away, and they were shot by a firing squad, by the way, for treason. Okay, for treason against Mexico. That was the idea of Santa Anna, of course, and all the other generals in the army, by the way. Okay. Now another general, Jose de Urrea, is sent to Goliad. Remember, Goliad was another town that was also taken by insurgents, and the same thing happens there. The town is surrounded by the Mexican army, and there's a massacre of the rebels as well. There are over perhaps even 300 rebels that were also executed for treason against Mexico as well. So far, Santana believes that he is indeed succeeding in putting down the different insurgencies and rebellions. Well, we accomplished that in El Alamo and Goliad. And now he turns his attention to this other revolutionary force led by Sam Houston. He hears news that Sam Houston was actually fleeing from Texas. He was trying to actually go into the United States, going to Louisiana, if you will. So he's pursuing Sam Houston up north. So it is really in a place that is nearby, of course, the present day city of Houston. This is one of the reasons why that city is going to bear his name, is because it was really around that area that Santana had to actually stop and rest for a night. So the Mexican soldiers are camping, if you will, they're resting, if you will, with the idea that, the next day we're going to proceed with the pursuit and so on. But while they're resting, while they were asleep, just before sunrise, Sam Houston charged, of course, Santana's army, and in only 18 minutes they decimated, and I mean literally 18 minutes, Sam Houston army. That some historians indicate that by that time it had grown, Sam Houston army, considerably, because they were, of course, volunteers that had been arriving into Texas, particularly from places like Kansas, for example. There were Kansas, of course, volunteers that arrived and joined Sam Houston army, and as this army grew, they charged Santa Anna's army just around sunrise, and in only 18 minutes, Santa Anna's army was totally decimated. Okay, Santa Anna, and along with about 50 or maybe 100 of his close associates, survived. They even tried to escape, by the way, but they were captured. Okay, they were captured by Sam Houston, and despite the fact that there was a motion, a strong motion by Sam Houston's men to execute Santana. They were, we got the dictators right here. Why don't we just, execute him and so on and so forth. Sam Houston, being more politically savvy, if you will, said, well, Santana will be more useful alive than dead, because ultimately he is the president of Mexico, and we can actually make him to sign a treaty. The treaty that actually grants Texas independence. Okay? So again, this is happening around, again, this area called today the city of Houston, outside, in a very legendary, almost epic battle called the Battle of San Jacinto. This is when Santana actually loses his army in the Battle of San Jacinto and is captured by Sam Houston, and is, to a certain degree, pressured, if you will, to sign the treaty by which Santa Anna, being the president of Mexico, is acknowledging and granting the independence of Texas. So what Sam Houston is saying, well, we need to return Santa Anna back to Mexico. We have the treaty, he signed it, and again, this is the way we win independence. Santa Anna has to be alive. The president that signed this document is still alive, and this is a legitimate document again. So again, he was more politically savvy, Sam Houston, that is to say, in having done that, if you will, despite the fact that Sam Houston's army was just outraged, at Santa Anna for what he did at El Alamo, the massacres and the like, of course. So Texas win independence under this new treaty that Santa Anna signs. It's called the Treaty of Velasco, signed on May 14. It's called the Treaty of Velasco. This is the treaty by which Mexico, under the leadership of Santa Anna, recognizes the independence, of course, of Texas. Now, under this treaty, what's important to note is that the border of Texas, there was a map that was drawn, by the way, in the treaty, and the border of Texas was now declared to be the Rio Grande River, as to be the southern border. In other words, it used to be the other river called the Nueces River. The Nueces River. The Nueces River. Okay? But this is the river that runs really from San Antonio to Corpus. Okay? So the southern border of Texas was actually pushed south of the Nueces River. Nueces River. Let me just write it here. The original border, that is to say, of Texas, was the Nueces River that ran from San Antonio to Corpus. But now, under the Treaty of Velasco, what Sam Houston is saying that no, now the border between Mexico and Texas is not going to be the Nueces River, it's going to be the Rio Grande. This is the river that actually divides Texas from Mexico, by the way, today. Okay? So there's a new arrangement, there's a new border, if you will. Now, Santa Anna returns back to Mexico, totally defeated, by the way, and humiliated. He lost his entire army. In Texas, he couldn't put down the rebellion. He was captured, and he was forced to sign the Treaty of Independence for Texas. So it was very humiliating, of course. So he has to save face, of course, in Mexico, and saying, this happened, and so on. But Texas is not really independent. Texas continues to be part of Mexico, he said. So he pretty much turns things around and said, well, under international law, this is what Santa Anna is saying in Mexico to save face, is that under international law, any treaty that is signed by force is not legitimate. And of course, I was forced to sign it. I had no other option. This is what this is not something that was done on a negotiating table or in a peace conference or anything like that. It was, again, I had people pointing guns at me, in other words. So what's important to note is that Mexico is not going to acknowledge the independence of Texas. Texas will, from the perspective of Mexico, will simply be a state in open rebellion. Only that. Then this is what they say. Okay, this is what they say. But nonetheless, the peoples of Texas will proceed to create their own republic. Something we're gonna get to see, of course, in the fifth topic of the semester. Now, in sum, again, what we have learned in this fourth topic, titled "The Texas Revolution," is that the influence of capitalism, Protestantism, and the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment were key to produce this revolution. This is something that we, of course, saw ever since the very first video, in the very first session. That is to say, the rise of private property with the rise of the merchant class in Europe, for example, particularly in England, led to the rise, again, of those principles called property rights and free enterprise that had to be honored and respected. The rise of the Protestant Revolution or Reformation also gave rise to the idea of democratic control of churches and religious freedom. The idea of democracy, people being in control of their own communities, if you will. That, of course, set off the conflict in England called the English Civil War. The King of England was really violating property rights against the merchants and also wanted to impose Catholicism in a Protestant country. That led to a democratic upheaval or revolution called the English Civil War. Ultimately, the monarchy lost that conflict, and we see the emergence of parliamentary systems of government with Bill of Rights, in other words. Of course, we see the ideas of the Enlightenment, the liberals' ideas of the Enlightenment, life, liberty, and property, the consent of the governed. That played also a key role in the second democratic revolution called the American Revolution of 1776. When the rights of merchants, planters, and farmers were violated, they declared independence from England as well because they believed wholeheartedly in those liberal ideas and created a new republic called the American Republic with a federal system of government and a Bill of Rights that honored life, liberty, and property, separation of church and state as well. Those same ideas played a key role, of course, in the Texas Revolution. We see the rise of a merchant class, entrepreneurs, investors, real estate agents, cotton plantations, cattle ranchers who felt threatened by the policies of Santa Anna in 1835 with the Constitution of 1835 that took away political rights, political representation from Texas, and threatened pretty much the property, the contracts that had been established by the liberals of previous administrations. And that produced, of course, the Texas Revolution. That's number one. But also, another thing to take away from this, as we're concluding this topic, is that the Texas Revolution was also motivated by the policies of Mexico to abolish slavery. We see very early on here in 1836 how slavery had become an integral part in the economy of Texas because of cotton agriculture. Okay, and we see the presence of cotton plantation owners introducing African slaves, and when Mexico threatened to take away their slaves, this also motivated to a very large degree the politics of Texas to think about independence. So perhaps the Texas Revolution was one of the very first signs of a state that seceded from a country that was moving against slavery. In this case, Texas seceded from Mexico. This foreshadowed the future secession of the slave states from the United States in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860 under the premise that he was going to abolish slavery. When he was actually elected, all of the southern states, the slaveholding states of the United States, seceded from the Union because they feared that this was going to be the end of slavery, that Lincoln was going to take away their property. So they left the Union. So this perhaps foreshadowed the same, dynamic. Okay, so this is the end of this topic. We have concluded the 3 sessions and cover pretty much everything that was related to this topic. The 5th topic will move into, of course, Texas creating a republic, a nation, something we're going to get to see, of course, more closely in the 1st session of the 5th topic coming next. This is all I have for you, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.